POWs and the Bottles of Wonder, June 12, 1944. Somewhere near St. Lô, Normandy, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a grey mist that clung to the hedgerows and the smell of diesel and wet earth. American GIs trudged through the mud, rifles slung over their shoulders, their uniforms caked with grime and exhaustion. But amidst the chaos of the advancing front, something strange shimmered in the soldiers' hands. Glass bottles, dark and glossy, capped with red labels. Inside a makeshift prisoner camp, not far behind the lines, a group of captured German soldiers watched in bewilderment. Their hands were still bound with rope, their uniforms soaked and torn. They were expecting the usual hardtack, canned meat, maybe bitter coffee, but instead they saw the Americans laughing, clinking those glass bottles together, before taking long, satisfied gulps. "Was ist das?" one of them muttered under his breath, staring as a corporal set down a crate marked "Property of Coca-Cola Company." The label meant nothing to them, yet the sight of American troops enjoying what looked like a civilian luxury in the middle of a war zone was incomprehensible. A German sergeant named Kurt Reiner, 31 years old, leaned forward, squinting through the wire fence. His eyes followed as a jeep drove past, piled high not only with ammunition, but with dozens more cases of those strange bottles. He turned to his comrade beside him, whispering in disbelief, "Sie bringen Lemonade, and die Front, they bring soda to the front lines." His comrade shook his head, unable to answer. On the other side of the fence, Private First Class Joe Carter, from Cincinnati, grinned as he cracked open another Coke. The bottle hissed, a sharp sound that cut through the heavy air. The carbonation sparkled against the overcast light. He took a deep swig, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, "Now that's the taste of home." The Germans stared as if watching a ritual they couldn't understand. This simple act of comfort in a world of fire and destruction. For Reiner, it was a revelation. Back in Germany, every ounce of sugar, every drop of fuel, every resource had been swallowed by the war machine. The Reich demanded sacrifice. Civilian pleasures had vanished long ago. Yet here were the Americans, thousands of miles from home, drinking ice-cold Coca-Cola, while artillery thundered just a few miles away. That night, as the prisoners huddled in their tents, Reiner couldn't stop thinking about it. Not the defeat, not even the humiliation, but that bottle. To him it wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of something vast, efficient, and almost absurdly confident. A nation that could fight a global war and still ship its soldiers a taste of home. He whispered into the dark, "Vielleicht haben wir nie verstanden, womit wir uns angelegt haben." Maybe we never understood what we were up against. Outside, a truck rumbled past, stenciled on its side, "Coca-Cola Bottling Company, Allied Forces Supply Division." The war machine of the United States didn't just build tanks and planes. It built happiness in a bottle, and it followed its soldiers wherever they went. The Germans could hardly believe it, but for the Americans, it was just another day on the road to victory. Section 2. The War Machine of Refreshment, July 1942, North Africa, near Al Alamein. Long before German POWs in Normandy saw those bottles, Coca-Cola had already marched to war. The company's executives had received an extraordinary order from Washington, one that blurred the line between civilian comfort and military logistics. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had signed a directive: ensure every man in uniform can have a bottle of Coca-Cola, wherever he is, and whatever it costs the government. It was more than a morale booster. It was psychological warfare wrapped in glass and sugar. In the burning sands of North Africa, Captain Robert Mackay, Quartermaster Corps, stood beside an American engineer supervising the assembly of something almost surreal, a fully functioning Coca-Cola bottling plant in the middle of the desert. The machinery gleamed beneath the harsh sunlight. Tanks of syrup, water purifiers, crates of empty bottles waiting to be filled. Generators hummed as soldiers unloaded crates of sugar and carbon dioxide cylinders. "Hell of a thing, isn't it?" said McKay, watching the first batch roll down the line. "Men are fighting a war, and we're out here making soda." The engineer laughed. "General's orders, keep 'em happy, keep 'em fighting." By the end of that month, the first bottles of Coca-Cola were being distributed to American troops across the North African front. Soldiers in dusty fatigues popped the caps with the butts of their rifles, passing bottles from hand to hand. For men who'd been drinking warm water out of canteens, that first cold sip was unforgettable, sweet, sharp, and utterly American. The bottles themselves became trophies. GS saved them, used them as makeshift canteens, even bartered them with British troops for cigarettes, and the Germans noticed. Captured documents from the Africa Corps mentioned the strange sight of Americans drinking soda in the field. To Rommel's intelligence officers it seemed ludicrous, and yet revealing. How could a nation be so rich, so organized, that it could ship soft drinks into a desert war zone, thousands of miles from home? The answer lay not in extravagance, but in efficiency. For every Coca-Cola bottling plant that sprang up, there was a quiet miracle of logistics behind it. American trucks delivering syrup, engineers building filters, mechanics maintaining refrigeration systems. Every bottle was a victory of supply chain over scarcity. Coca-Cola didn't just follow the troops, it became part of the military machine. Each bottling unit was built to military standards, mobile and rugged, designed to move with the front. In time they were everywhere: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, England, France, the Pacific. To German soldiers who would later become prisoners, the idea of such abundance seemed almost impossible. In the Reich, luxury was rationed. The Wehrmacht drank ersatz coffee. The civilians survived on bread mixed with sawdust. Even beer had become rare. Yet the Americans had found a way to make war taste like home. When a German officer captured in Tunisia was offered a Coke by his American counterpart, he refused at first, thinking it a mockery, but after a moment he accepted, tasted it, and sat in silence. His eyes lingered on the label, the foreign letters, the red symbol of a nation that even in battle refused to give up comfort. He murmured quietly to himself, "If they can do this in wartime, what can they do in peace?" He didn't know that back in the US, the Coca-Cola Company had already pledged that no matter where the war went, they would follow, and soon they did. Section 3. Coke Goes to War. February 1943. Port Moresby, New Guinea. A thick blanket of humidity hung over the Allied base. The air smelled of sweat, oil, and jungle decay. American troops unloading supplies from cargo ships wiped their brows, moving crates stenciled with markings that read, U.S. Army Quartermaster. Beverage, carbonated. In one of those crates, nestled between fuel drums and rations, were hundreds of Coca-Cola bottles, each packed carefully in straw. The bottles had traveled thousands of miles by sea, through U-boat-infested waters, to reach soldiers on a distant tropical island. When the men cracked them open, the fizz was faint, but still there, enough to make the jungle heat momentarily bearable. Nearby, Sergeant Bill Hanley, 25, from Chicago, leaned against a palm tree. Coke bottle in hand, he looked out at the mist-covered hills and said to his buddy, "You know, if Coke can get here, we can get anywhere." It wasn't just bravado, it was the truth. By early 1943, the U.S. War Department and the Coca-Cola Company had formed what was effectively a partnership of morale and manufacturing. Coca-Cola set up an entire division dedicated to the war effort. The Technical Observer Corps. Their mission was simple: follow the troops, build bottling plants, and make sure every soldier could get a cold drink, even at the edge of the world. The company dispatched engineer officers, nicknamed Coca-Cola colonels, though most held the rank of captain or lieutenant, to oversee the construction of mobile plants near the front lines. Each plant could produce up to 3,000 bottles a day, using local water, purified by military-grade filtration, mixed with syrup shipped from the States. These weren't small-time operations. They were industrial miracles under combat conditions. Some plants ran within earshot of artillery fire. Others were set up on captured airfields within days of an invasion. By war's end, over 64 bottling plants had been built across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Everywhere American boots landed, Coca-Cola followed. To the troops, it became more than a drink. It was a reminder of home, a small piece of America that no enemy could destroy. In the Pacific, soldiers toasted victories with it. In Europe, they shared bottles in foxholes. On D-Day, Coke was in the landing supply, manifest, and in every captured town, local civilians watched in wonder as American convoys unloaded, not just munitions and fuel, but soda pop, for German and Japanese troops who observed it. The sight was both baffling and demoralizing. Reports from captured enemy diaries later revealed lines like, "The Americans are strange. They bring music, cigarettes, and even soft drinks into battle." To the Axis powers, war was total, sacrifice and austerity. To the Americans, war was industrial, efficient, organized, and humanized by comfort. The difference was more than cultural. It was symbolic of two worlds colliding, one built on ideology, the other on productivity and abundance. In that collision, even a bottle of Coke could become a weapon of morale. As one U.S. general said later, half-jokingly, "We couldn't have won the war without the Sherman tank, the Jeep, and Coca-Cola." But what the soldiers didn't know yet was that Coca-Cola's influence would go even further and outlast the war itself. Section 4. When the Germans saw it up close, August 1944, near Chartres, France. The thunder of artillery had faded into the distance. The hedgerows were scorched, and the smoke still hung low over the countryside. American columns rolled eastward. Jeeps, half-tracks, and trucks, bearing crates upon crates of supplies. Among them, nestled between rations and ammunition, were the familiar red logos, Coca-Cola. In a field-turned prison camp, rows of weary German POWs sat behind barbed wire. Some were barely out of their teens. Others were battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. They'd been captured after a desperate retreat, their units shattered by Allied firepower. Now, as they waited under guard, their eyes followed an American truck reversing nearby. The tailgate dropped, and out came wooden crates, filled with glass bottles, clinking together in the sun. Private Joe Carter, the same soldier who'd been in Normandy weeks earlier, carried a crate toward the mess tent, whistling. He popped open a bottle, took a long drink, and leaned back against the truck. Across the wire, Sergeant Kurt Reiner watched him with silent fascination. He turned to another prisoner, Hans Becker, a former factory foreman from Bremen. "They ship this drink, across an ocean, through battle, just for the soldiers." Becker nodded slowly, incredulous. "It's madness. Or maybe it's something else." A nearby guard, overhearing them, smiled and called out, "You fellas want a Coke?" The Germans froze. For a moment, they thought it was a taunt, some cruel gesture, meant to mock their defeat. But when the guard tossed a bottle over the fence, landing softly in the dirt at Reiner's feet, the tone shifted. Reiner hesitated, then picked it up. The glass was cold to the touch. He examined the strange English letters,
the red logo, the contour of the bottle. Carefully he pried off the cap with a rock. A hiss escaped, sharp, alive. Tiny bubbles rose to the surface. He took a cautious sip. The sweetness exploded across his tongue. Bright, fizzy, utterly alien. For a brief instant, he was no longer a prisoner of war. The fatigue, the hunger, the fear, all seemed to fade under that unfamiliar taste. His comrades watched silently as he took another drink. Then one by one, the bottles made their way down the line. The Americans laughed softly, passing a few more over the fence. To the prisoners, the moment was disorienting. A collision of worlds. The same enemy that had just crushed their battalion was now sharing a soft drink. Reiner wiped his mouth, still staring at the bottle. "This is what they fight with," he murmured. "They bring comfort to the front. We bring only sacrifice." Becker nodded, his voice low. "It's not madness, it's power. The power to make war feel like home." Later that night, as the camp quieted, and the prisoners drifted into uneasy sleep, Reiner turned the empty bottle over in his hand. He studied it like a relic. The curvature, the embossed logo, the faint scent of caramel sugar. He realized then that what they'd seen wasn't just abundance, it was belief. The Americans fought as if the world itself could be rebuilt in their image, as if even war could be civilized by convenience, and that thought unsettled him more than any weapon. Weeks later, when U.S. officers interrogated the POWs, some of them mentioned it. The Coca-Cola. They spoke of it not with resentment, but awe. To them it was proof of a different kind of empire, one that conquered, not through fear, but through comfort.
Section 5. The Army that Marched on Sugar and Steel. September 1944. Allied Supply Depot, Cherbourg, France. The docks were a frenzy of activity. Cargo ships unloaded a tidal wave of supplies, fuel drums, ammunition crates, spare tank parts, crates of Spam, and mountains of Coca-Cola bottles, stacked in pyramids. Beside the piers, forklifts rumbled across the cobblestones, soldiers shouted orders, and the air smelled of diesel, salt water, and syrup. Each crate was stamped with the Coca-Cola logo and the slogan, "Drink Coca-Cola, property of the U.S. Army." To an outsider, it looked absurd, an empire of soda, in the middle of a world war. But to the American military, it was a symbol of order, amid chaos. Inside a makeshift supply office, overlooking the harbor, Major Charles Watson, logistics officer for the First Army, ran his finger down a clipboard. "Sugar, fuel, ammunition, and Coca-Cola," he muttered, half smiling. "Can't run the war without that." His aide laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Watson wasn't kidding. In official War Department memos, Coca-Cola was categorized under morale essentials, a resource deemed as important as mail delivery or medical supplies. The Army Quartermaster Corps calculated that each soldier consumed an average of a bottle a day, which meant millions of bottles per month. To meet that demand, Coca-Cola had mobilized one of the most sophisticated logistics systems ever devised, piggybacking on military convoys, transport ships, and even C-47 cargo planes. In some depots, soldiers used Coca-Cola trucks to haul both soda and ammunition. It became a running joke among the troops that the Coke supply line was the only one that never broke down. Even High Command noticed. In his letters home, General Eisenhower mentioned the drink with affection and gratitude. "It reminds the men what they're fighting for," he wrote. To GIs far from home, that wasn't an exaggeration. In muddy foxholes and bombed-out towns, the hiss of a bottle cap popping open was the sound of sanity. It was a tiny reminder that the world hadn't completely gone mad. Coca-Cola advertisements back home echoed this sentiment. Posters read, "Wherever he is, he's got a Coke." The imagery was simple: a smiling soldier in uniform, bottle in hand, somewhere on the front lines,
with the red and white logo shining like a beacon of normal life. Coca-Cola became inseparable from the identity of the American soldier. It wasn't just a drink. It was a statement of who they were and what they represented: comfort, abundance, and optimism, even amid destruction. Back in Germany, where shortages were crippling, the contrast was staggering. Civilians rationed bread and soap. Coffee was replaced by roasted barley. A single orange was a luxury. And yet the enemy, the Americans, had Coca-Cola trucks rolling into combat zones. The Reich's propaganda ministry tried to spin it as wasteful decadence. Radio broadcasts mocked American troops for their childish taste for sugary drinks. But behind the scenes, German officers couldn't help but marvel at the industrial power that made it possible. Because to deliver a Coke to a soldier on the front line, thousands of unseen workers, machines, and factories had to move in perfect rhythm. That bottle represented the full might of American industry, its capacity to produce everything, from bombers to beverages, on a scale the world had never seen. And for the Germans who saw it firsthand, that realization was sobering. Rainer, now in a POW camp outside Le Havre, understood it too. As he sat carving wood in the shade of a tent, he saw more Coca-Cola trucks passing by on the highway, endless lines of them, heading east. He shook his head and said quietly, "They don't fight like us. They fight with everything." He wasn't wrong. Section 6: Fanta and the War at Home. While American soldiers were drinking ice-cold Coke in the deserts of Africa and the jungles of the Pacific, something unexpected was happening deep inside Nazi Germany. Behind blackout curtains and bomb-shattered glass, the German branch of the Coca-Cola Company was struggling to survive, cut off from Atlanta, from syrup shipments, and from the world. The man in charge was Max Keith, head of Coca-Cola GmbH in Germany. A sharp, calculating businessman, Keith had spent years building the brand under the shadow of the Third Reich. He wore a neat gray suit, kept politics at arm's length, and focused on one thing: keeping his factories running. But when the United States entered the war in December 1941, everything changed. Trade routes were severed. Imports from America were banned. The syrup, the lifeblood of Coca-Cola, could no longer reach German shores. For most companies, that would have been the end. But Keith refused to let his empire collapse. He gathered his chemists in a cold, dimly lit office in early 1942 and said, "If we can't make Coca-Cola, we'll make something new." With no access to Coke's ingredients, the team scavenged whatever the wartime economy could offer: whey, leftover apple fibers, fruit pulp, and beet sugar. Out of this unlikely mixture, they created a new drink: pale, sweet, and citrus-flavored. They named it Fanta, short for fantasy, imagination. It was a desperate invention, born out of isolation, yet it became a symbol of German resourcefulness. Within months, Fanta was being bottled and sold across the Reich. Families drank it at Sunday meals. Factories used it to flavor soups and sauces when fruit was scarce. The irony was almost poetic. While the world's most powerful democracy was fighting with Coca-Cola at its side, Nazi Germany was drinking its substitute. Keith kept the business alive throughout the war, navigating the thin line between patriotism and survival. He attended Nazi industry meetings when required, but refused to join the party. He ensured his workers were fed and his plants protected from total destruction. And when Allied forces finally entered Germany in 1945, he made a bold move. He wrote directly to Coca-Cola's headquarters in Atlanta, offering to return the entire German operation, intact and debt-free, back to American control. In the rubble of post-war Berlin, Coca-Cola executives were astonished to find that Keith had not only preserved the company's assets, but had grown them. While much of Germany lay in ruins, Coca-Cola GmbH was ready to resume production. By 1948, Fanta was officially reabsorbed into the Coca-Cola family. A drink created out of wartime scarcity would later become one of the company's most successful global brands. But in 1942, none of that was known. In those years, a strange duality existed, two worlds at war, both drinking beverages born of the same brand. In the Pacific, an American GI lifted a bottle of Coke under a blazing sun. In Berlin, a factory worker drank Fanta in a candlelit kitchen, hiding from the air raids. Neither knew that their drinks were distant cousins, divided by ideology, but linked by invention. Back on the Western Front, German POWs, who'd seen Coke bottles in American hands, would later tell Allied interrogators about Fanta. "We had something like it," they'd say, but it wasn't the same. To them, the difference wasn't just taste, it was meaning. Coca-Cola meant abundance, logistics, and freedom. Fanta meant substitution, survival, and limits. Two sides of the same industrial coin, and a mirror of the war itself.
Section 7. Coca-Cola and the Spirit of the GI Des. December 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. Snow was falling thick and fast across the dark forests of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was raging, the last desperate German counteroffensive of the war. American soldiers dug into the frozen ground, frostbitten and hungry, surrounded by enemy fire. Inside a shattered farmhouse near Bastogne, Corporal Joe Carter, the same man who'd once handed Cokes to German prisoners, sat beside a sputtering stove, trying to warm his hands. Around him, a handful of men from the 21st Airborne, huddled under blankets, their helmets rimmed with ice. From his rucksack, Carter pulled something miraculous, a single glass bottle, wrapped in cloth to keep it from breaking. The red label was faded, the glass scratched, but it was unmistakable. "Where the hell did you get that?" one of the men asked, eyes wide. Carter grinned. "Quartermaster dropped a crate before we got cut off. Been saving it for a bad day." He popped a cap with his bayonet. The sound was as sharp and alive as the crack of a rifle. They passed it around in silence. Each man took a sip, savoring it like it was a relic from home. The taste of summer, laughter, and safety. Outside, artillery thundered in the distance, but for a brief, shining moment, the war seemed to pause. Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink anymore. It was a link, a thin, unbreakable thread connecting every American soldier, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific to the heart of home. It was a reminder that beyond the mud and the blood, there was still something worth fighting for. Not just victory, but the way of life that victory represented. When the German offensive finally broke and Allied reinforcements pushed through, Carter's unit emerged from Bastogne, battered but unbroken. A few weeks later, when they reached a supply point, a truck driver shouted, "Hey, 21st, got something for you." He tossed them an ice-cold bottle of Coke. The men roared with laughter. For the first time in weeks, they smiled without pain. Across the Atlantic, back in the States, Coca-Cola executives were running double shifts, producing billions of bottles for both the troops and civilians. Their factories hummed around the clock, their advertisements proclaiming, "Every Coke we ship brings America a little closer to victory." In towns from Kansas to California, mothers and sweethearts clipped those ads, whispering, "Maybe he's drinking one right now." And he probably was. Even high-ranking officers took note of the drink's strange, enduring morale power. General Omar Bradley once remarked that Coca-Cola did more for the fighting man than any other single piece of comfort equipment we had. To the Germans who saw it, the prisoners, the captured officers, the defeated soldiers, it became something more than a beverage. It was proof of how differently the Americans waged war. Where the Wehrmacht demanded sacrifice, the Americans demanded comfort for courage. Where the Reich
glorified suffering. The US military glorified resilience, with a smile, a song, and a bottle of Coke. And the soldiers believed in. As Carter and his men moved deeper into Germany in 1945, they found Coke waiting for them at every depot, every rest camp, every captured town. It was as if the drink itself were marching with the army. At night they'd sit around fires, bottles in hand, watching the horizon glow with artillery flashes. Carter would sometimes chuckle and say, "You know, the Jerry's got no idea. They think we're fighting with bullets. Truth is, we're fighting with bubble." The men laughed, but there was truth in it, because Coca-Cola had become the taste of victory. Section 8. The Symbol of a New World. May 1945, Munich, Germany. The war was over. American troops rolled through the smoking ruins of what had once been the proud heart of the Reich. Flags fluttered from bombed-out windows. German soldiers shuffled past in endless columns, disarmed, defeated, hollow-eyed. But amid the rubble, another sound began to rise. Laughter, music, the hiss of soda bottles open. At an improvised American canteen in downtown Munich, a line of GIs formed beside a makeshift counter, built from salvaged planks. A Red Cross volunteer handed out sandwiches, cigarettes, and of course ice-cold Coca-Cola. The drink had made its way into victory celebrations across Europe. At every liberated city, Coke was there. Paris, Rome, Brussels, now Munich. The bottles appeared as surely as the American flag. To the locals, it became a spectacle. Children peered curiously at the red labels. Civilians traded cigarettes for empty bottles to keep as souvenirs. One elderly German man, wrapped in a tattered coat, watched the soldiers clinking bottles and said quietly, "So that's what victory tastes like." Among the crowd stood Sergeant Kurt Reiner, now a free man, recently released from the POW camp. After the surrender, he had seen the drink before, back in Normandy, when he was a prisoner behind the wire. Now standing in the ruins of his homeland, he saw it everywhere. In the hands of soldiers, in the hands of smiling civilians, even in the windows of reopened cafes. It was the same drink, but in a different world. Reiner approached an American supply officer and gestured toward the crate. "Could I buy one?" The officer smiled and tossed him a bottle. "On the house, buddy. War's over." Reiner caught it, nodding silently. He looked at the curved glass, the label bright against the gray ash of the city. The same symbol he had once viewed as an absurd luxury now felt like something else entirely, a glimpse into the future. He took a sip, the taste unchanged, familiar, and foreign all at once. Around him the soldiers laughed and took photographs. Somewhere, a band played "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." It was in that moment Reiner understood what the Germans had never truly grasped during the war, that American power wasn't just in its weapons, but in its culture, its ability to export comfort, optimism, and identity across the globe. Wherever the Americans went, Coca-Cola went, and wherever Coca-Cola went, America stayed. It wasn't conquest through force, but through familiarity. By the end of 1945, new bottling plants were already opening in Germany under American supervision. The same machinery that had once served Fanta now churned out Coca-Cola again, in greater numbers than ever before. To a generation of Germans, the red label became one of the first symbols of the post-war world, of peace, prosperity, and the strange new age of consumerism, rising from the rubble. And to the Americans, it was proof that their ideals could travel farther than their army. Coca-Cola wasn't just a soft drink, it was the message in a bottle, the idea that freedom could be sweet, tangible, and bottled for anyone to taste. Back home, advertisements captured that feeling perfectly. Posters showed soldiers coming home, handing bottles of Coke to their families, smiling beneath headlines that read, "The pause that refreshes the world." In a way, it wasn't an exaggeration. From the deserts of Africa to the snows of Belgium, from POW camps to victory parades, that simple drink had followed every soldier, a companion, a comfort, a quiet declaration of what America fought for, and in the eyes of the world, especially those who had once fought against it, that red label would forever symbolize something impossible to defeat, not just an army, but a way of life.
Section 9. The Post-War Legacy. From Battlefield to Billboard. 1946. Frankfurt, Germany. The ruins were slowly being cleared, streets reopened, and factories rebuilt. Amid the hum of reconstruction, a new sound echoed through the industrial yards, the clinking of glass bottles rolling off fresh conveyor belts. The first Coca-Cola bottling plant to reopen in occupied Germany was back in full operation. American technicians trained local workers, many of them ex-soldiers or displaced civilians, in the art of carbonation and precision bottling. To them, this was more than a job. It was participation in a new world, one not built on ideology, but on commerce and connection. The plant manager, a wiry man named Karl Hoffmann, had been a Wehrmacht mechanic. Now, wearing a crisp work uniform with a Coca-Cola patch stitched on the shoulder, he oversaw production lines that stretched the length of the building. The smell of syrup and sugar filled the air. Outside, children gathered near the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the trucks rolling out. Trucks painted bright red, marked with that same looping white script that had once baffled their fathers in the war. In towns still half in ruins, Coca-Cola became a symbol of normalcy. Soldiers, civilians, and even former enemies now drank from the same bottles. Bars reopened. Cafes stocked Coca-Cola alongside beer. American GIs shared it freely with locals, gestures that often meant more than any political speech. For young Germans, Coke represented something intoxicating, not just refreshment, but modernity. It wasn't propaganda, it was presence. Within a few short years, the company's reach exploded across the recovering continent. By 1948, there were Coca-Cola bottling plants in Belgium, France, Italy, the Netherlands, and West Germany, each producing millions of bottles per month, and each bottle carried with it the same message that America's way of life had arrived to stay. The Coca-Cola Company seized the moment. Its post-war advertising shifted from battlefield heroism to peace and unity. Billboards showed soldiers coming home, reuniting with loved ones, sharing Coke at picnics or dance halls. Radio jingles crooned, "Have a Coke, it's the American way to say, welcome back." In 1947, a series of ads titled, "Coke Serves Hospitality Everywhere," featured photographs of American troops sharing Coca-Cola with European civilians in farmhouses, cafes, and city squares, still scarred by war. The imagery was powerful. An American hand passing a Coke to a smiling German boy, a French girl toasting with an American GI, a factory worker lifting a bottle beside a US sergeant. It was the visual language of peace, simple, human, and irresistible. In Washington, the State Department quietly supported it. They saw Coca-Cola not just as a business, but as a cultural ambassador, a tool of diplomacy. And in truth, it worked. Where propaganda failed, Coca-Cola succeeded, because it didn't preach, it invited. It didn't demand loyalty, it offered comfort. By 1950, Coca-Cola was being bottled in more than 60 countries, and wherever it went, the sight of that red label stirred a memory of soldiers who had come bringing not just war, but a strange kind of warmth. In Germany, Kurt Reiner, now a civilian mechanic, stood outside a cafe on a summer afternoon. American swing music played from a radio. Children rode bicycles past the fountain. He bought a Coca-Cola from a street vendor and leaned against a lamppost, watching the city hum with life again. He smiled faintly and said to himself, "It seems the Americans have won more than the war." He wasn't wrong. The empire of Coca-Cola had survived the conflict, and now it was conquering hearts, one bottle at a time. Section 10.
the symbol of abundance, what the German POWs never forgot. 1955, Bremen, West Germany. A reunion of former Wehrmacht soldiers gathered in a modest veterans' hall on the outskirts of town. The walls were lined with photographs, not of battlefields or medals, but of men who had once been prisoners, workers, or wanderers in the aftermath of war. At one table sat Kurt Reiner, now in his 40s. His hair was thinner, his uniform long replaced by a mechanic's coveralls. He lifted a glass bottle of Coca-Cola and chuckled softly. "Can you believe it?" he said to his friend Otto, another ex-soldier. "In '43, I thought this drink was some kind of American miracle, and now my son buys it from a vending machine." Otto grinned, tilting his bottle toward Kurt's. "They didn't just win the war, Kurt. They bottled it." The men laughed, but beneath it, there was an undertone of awe. For those who had once faced the Americans on the battlefield, or in captivity, Coca-Cola had become the symbol of something they could never quite explain. It wasn't just sugar and fizz. It was the idea that a nation could produce so much comfort, even in the middle of total war. That a country could send not just tanks and planes to the front, but bottles of joy. During the war, they had seen soldiers drink it after firefights, mechanics sip it between repairs, and medics hand it to the wounded. Even when shells fell and skies burned, there always seemed to be time for a Coke. To the Germans, it was both absurd and awe-inspiring, a glimpse into a culture of industrial power, unlike anything they had known. Kurt remembered the first time he'd seen it, that cold bottle in the POW camp. The taste had startled him, but what truly lingered was the thought, if they can bring this to war, what can't they do? It haunted him, in a strangely comforting way, even after peace returned. Now, more than a decade later, Coca-Cola trucks rolled through his city daily, delivering crates to cafes, cinemas and factories. The same red logo that once seemed foreign, now decorated German billboards, bus stops, and sporting events. It wasn't just an American drink anymore. It had become part of Europe's post-war identity, the sound of caps popping, bottles clinking, and ice fizzing over glass. Children who'd never seen a bomb crater or ration ticket now drank Coca-Cola without thinking twice. To them, it was simply the taste of normal life. But to men like Kurt and Otto, it was something else. A reminder of contrast. The contrast between scarcity and surplus, between collapse and recovery, between the war they lost and the world that emerged from its ashes. When historians later interviewed German POWs about their experiences with American forces, many mentioned the same thing. Not weapons, not rations, not cigarettes, but Coca-Cola. One former Luftwaffe pilot told a reporter in 1961, the sentiment spread among veterans, in memoirs, letters, and interviews. Coca-Cola often appeared as shorthand for America's inexhaustible capacity. It wasn't propaganda. It was observation. In a world shattered by deprivation, the sight of a soldier drinking an ice-cold Coke on the front line had become the purest symbol of modern abundance, and decades later, that image still endured. Kurt's grandson would grow up hearing his stories, not of blood and gunfire, but of that strange day in the POW camp when he first tasted America in a bottle. He'd ask, "Opa, what did it taste like?" Kurt would smile and reply, "The same future that had begun not with a treaty or a surrender, but with a hiss of carbonation, a burst of bubbles, and the unmistakable sound of a Coca-Cola bottle being opened in the middle of war." Because in the end, history isn't only written by the victor, sometimes it's bottled by them.